It begins, as all unsettling tales often do, in the mist-hung valleys of Eastern Europe, where the forest whispers old names and secrets pool in the stone foundations of castles. The year is 1585, and the chill never really leaves the Carpathians. Not in summer. Not in spring. Not in the blood. The road to Cactus winds like a serpent up into the hills of northern Hungary, what we now call Slovakia. Back then, the trees were older, the people quieter, and the noble families louder than life, ruling over the muddy villages with a disdainful eye and a gilded heel. And none stood higher, colder, or crueler than the Bathorys. She was born Elizabeth. Erzsébet in the native tongue. A name that passed down like a dagger through the ribcage of history. Erzsébet Bathory, daughter of the raven-haired noble line of Etched, baptized in a silver basin, swaddled in ermine, and watched over by servants who would never meet her eyes. The Bathorys were ancient, descended from warlords and dragon slayers, they claimed, as though nobility were carved from monster bones. She came into the world in a castle with walls as thick as a man is tall, surrounded by tapestries of myth and candlelight too dim to chase the corners into honesty. From the start, she was not normal, though normal was a word few could afford to apply to aristocracy. She was clever, in a way that made adults uncomfortable. She listened more than she spoke, watched more than she laughed. They said she had the look, not beauty, no, although she had that too. But something in the eyes. That particular quiet that makes the hair on the back of your neck rise like a prayer. And from the beginning, blood seemed to call to her. Not in the way of curses or prophecy. This is not that kind of story, not exactly, but in the ordinary, brutal reality of medieval nobility. The Bathorys fought wars, slaughtered rivals, and ruled lands soaked in peasant sweat and noble arrogance. Erzsébet, at age 6, saw her first public execution from the high windows of Etched Castle. A thief. Horses tore the man in two. The crowd wailed. She did not blink. Some said she smiled. But children are strange, aren't they? Especially children reared in the lap of unchecked power, where discipline is a show and consequences are for the poor. By 10, she could read and write Latin, German, Hungarian, and Greek. She recited Ovid while the other girls practiced stitching samplers. She memorized legal codes for amusement. A mind like that was a dangerous gift, especially in a girl. But her family didn't mind. They saw only utility. Elizabeth was destined to be wed young, and she knew it. Noble girls were bred like prize horses and traded like land deeds. So at age 11, she was promised to Ferenc Nadasdy, a boy 5 years her senior from a neighboring noble house almost as prestigious, though not quite so tainted with rumors. The wedding would take place in 5 years. Until then, she was sent to the Nadasdy estate to learn how to be a wife, to be molded. Ferenc was away most of the time. Military training, political posturing, visits to court. But when he was home, he made his presence felt. He was tall, broad, handsome in the brutal, wolfish way that soldiers are. He was known as the Black Knight of Hungary, famed for impaling Turks on pikes along the border and sending baskets of ears back to his superiors. Romantic, no? They married in 1575, when Erzsébet was 15 and Ferenc 20. The wedding was so extravagant that villagers reported dreaming of the fireworks for days afterward. As a wedding gift, Ferenc gave his bride Cactus Castle, nestled deep in the Carpathians, surrounded by forests thick with superstition and long trails of unmarked graves. There, isolated among the trees and howling wind, the legend would fester. It was not immediate, of course. Infamy rarely is. At first, she played the role. Hostess. Wife. Lady of the house. She managed the estate while Ferenc was off at war, as husbands so often were. And she was good at it, too good maybe. She demanded order, structure, obedience. And punishment. She believed in justice the way one believes in architecture. Precise, cold, and unforgiving. When a servant girl stole a silver spoon, Erzsébet had her whipped until the skin peeled. Another was burned with hot tongs. A third was forced to strip naked and stand outside in the snow until her breath no longer fogged. Servants whispered, prayed, vanished. The villagers began to fear the black-cloaked carriage that carried her through town. They said the wheels never muddied, that the horses had eyes like coins, that the Countess did not age. And yet, her cruelty was still considered manageable, within the boundaries of noble eccentricity. After all, she was a Bathory. Discipline was her right. Then Ferenc died. Suddenly, unexpectedly. 1604. Fever, they said. Or poison. Or witchcraft. The rumors swirled like ash on the wind, but the facts remained. The Black Knight was gone. And Erzsébet was alone. Widowed at 44, childless, except for a few children who rarely saw her, rich beyond reason, and now free of a man who had matched, and perhaps enabled, her cruelty. Countess changed then. Became quieter. Hungrier. She spent more time in the tower. Built strange rooms. Requested peculiar herbs from apothecaries. Hired women from distant towns. Pretty girls. Young ones. Virgins, they said. One day a servant slipped while brushing her hair. Pulled a strand too hard. Erzsébet struck her. The girl's nose bled. Some say a few drops landed on the Countess's hand. And she noticed how pale the skin beneath the blood looked. How smooth. That night she bathed. The next day, another girl vanished. And so it began. Not with madness, but method. With small indulgences. Controlled rituals. Ice-cold calculation wrapped in the silken folds of nobility. Erzsébet did not see herself as cruel. She saw herself as curious. Enlightened even. A woman discovering the boundaries of nature. How much youth could be borrowed, she wondered, from the body of another? How long could beauty be maintained, if one only reached deep enough into the bone and marrow of purity? She began experimenting. Slowly at first. Bleeding girls. Smearing it on her face. Mixing concoctions of iron and flower oil. Chanting words she'd read in forgotten books. Consulting alchemists. They all said the same thing: youth fades. Beauty rots. Only death is permanent. But Erzsébet was not content with that. She wanted permanence. And permanence, it turned out, could be stitched. Soon she had help. Women loyal to her. A nursemaid named Ilona, twisted with bitterness. A servant named Dorothea, fierce and silent. Others came and went. They did not question. They obeyed. Some out of fear. Some out of admiration. A few perhaps out of love. They scouted villages. Lured girls with promises of work, coins, silk ribbons. They brought them to Countess. They did not leave. The castle's lower rooms were lined with stone and iron hooks. Buckets. Razors. Branding rods. There was a draining table. A red silk dress that shimmered when she twirled. And the face masks. Sewn from skin. She would wear them during dinner sometimes. Delicate things. Pale. Stretched. Still holding the blush of youth like pressed petals. And the rumors grew. Children whispered stories in the dark. Of a pale lady who walked with no shadow. Of screams carried on the wind from the castle at night. Of carts that returned empty, though they left full of laughter and ribboned hair. But the nobility said nothing. Why would they? She was a Bathory. Her blood was ancient, her coin endless, her lands essential. Her crimes, if they could be called that, were the eccentricities of a grieving widow. Until one day, a girl went missing who was not poor. Not a peasant. Not nameless. She had a father. A nobleman. And that changed everything. But not yet. Not here. For now, Countess stands quiet under the moon, its tower windows flickering with candlelight. And somewhere deep inside, the Countess smiles, brushing her hair before a mirror that no longer reflects anything at all. Because, after all, youth is a matter of perception. And perception can be manipulated. Even if it takes skin. Winter came early that year. Thick and sullen, as if the sky itself had grown tired of pretending warmth was ever meant for these lands. Snow blanketed the hills around Countess like a burial shroud, muffling every scream, every snapped bone, every secret. Inside the castle, candles burned longer. The kitchens no longer sent up the smell of roast or stew, only iron, vinegar, and the faintest whisper of rosewater to mask what could never be truly hidden. The villagers, for their part, said little. You don't accuse the mountain of thunder. You simply kneel, and hope the lightning chooses someone else. Still, fear is not a silent guest. It talks behind hands, behind doors, in market stalls. And so stories bloomed like frostbite across the region. Erzsébet Bathory, the Lady of Cactus, was whispered to be more than cruel, more than mad. They said she bathed in the blood of virgins to stay young, that she wore their faces as masks, that her hands were too smooth, her voice too sweet, her eyes too quiet for any human woman. But it wasn't just stories anymore. Girls were vanishing. Not a few. Dozens. Peasants and noble daughters alike. And though the nobility tolerated much, they had their limits, especially when one of their own bled. Her name was Anna. She was 16, daughter of a lesser baron with too much pride and not enough coin. He'd sent her to Cactus in the hopes that service to the Countess might smooth his debts and gain favor. She was blonde, soft-spoken, innocent in the way only the well-fed could afford to be. She lasted 4 days. When her father received no letters, he sent a messenger. The messenger returned pale, shaking, saying only that Anna had taken ill and passed peacefully in the night. The body was never sent home. The baron rode out himself, sword on his hip and fury in his chest. He did not get past the castle gates. They found his horse days later, riderless. Its flanks were marked with strange symbols burned into the hide, too sharp, too neat, too deliberate for accident or madness. That was the turning point. Because if there is one thing more powerful than fear, it is insult. And Erzsébet had insulted the nobility by treating one of their own as if they were common flesh. Disposable. Uncounted. The whispers turned to letters. The letters to petitions. And the petitions reached the ears of King Matthias too. But kings do not act on rumor. Not unless there's coin in it. Fortunately, Erzsébet owed him quite a bit of that. Ferenc had taken loans during the wars, pledging portions of the Bathory fortune. Debts unpaid. This was leverage. And leverage, in politics, is more useful than evidence. The king commissioned Georgi Thurzo, cousin to Erzsébet, ironically enough, and Palatine of Hungary, to investigate the situation at Cactus. A fox sent to judge another fox, really. But Thurzo was ambitious. He saw opportunity in spectacle. He rode out in secret, with men sworn to silence and priests ready to sanctify the sins they would find. They arrived just after Christmas, in the dying days of 1610, when the world was still and silent beneath a gray and brittle sky. The gates were open. That was the first odd thing. The servants didn't answer. That was the second. And the third, well, that was the smell. It rolled out of the castle like heat, sweet and rotten, familiar only to those who have stood too long on battlefields or near plague carts. They entered through the main hall, weapons drawn. The hearth had long since gone cold. Candles flickered, low and orange, illuminating a trail of something dark that led down the corridor. In the lower chambers, they found the first girl. She was alive. Barely. Shackled to the wall by her wrists, arms blackened with bruises, her mouth sewn shut with silver wire. Her eyes blinked once, twice, and then stopped. Thurzo said nothing. He simply nodded to his men, who fanned out in pairs. What they found, in the next hour, would become the bedrock of a legend so grotesque it still echoes through centuries. 4 corpses. 3 fresh. 1 long dead. A girl stuffed into a barrel, ribs broken inward. Another with her feet sliced off and salt rubbed into the wounds. A third skinned in patches like an animal mid-butchery, and the fourth, laid out on a table, open-chested, eyes still wet. There were ledgers, too. Pages bound in leather, written in Erzsébet's own hand. Names. Dates. Methods. An account book of horror. And in the center of it all, seated calmly in a gown dyed the deep red of clotted blood, Erzsébet herself. She did not scream. She did not run. She did not beg. She looked at Thurzo and said, "You are early. I was preparing tea." That moment, strange, poised, disarmingly mundane, would haunt Thurzo for the rest of his life. Because in it, he saw not madness, but confidence. Routine. As if she truly believed that none of this was wrong. Or rather, that wrongness itself was a thing reserved for the weak. They arrested her on the spot, though not without ceremony. She was, after all, a countess. Noble blood did not stain easily, even with 100 corpses beneath it. The servants were taken too, Ilona, Dorothea, and others. Tortured. Confessed. Spilled every drop of horror they'd ever seen. They described rooms where the floors were always sticky. Implements designed for the sole purpose of creative agony. A ritual bath made of brass, shaped like a swan, where girls were drained like wine casks. One servant told of a mask, fashioned from human skin, lips still intact, that Erzsébet would wear while humming lullabies. And still, she never confessed. Never wept. Never repented. When asked why she did it, she simply stared. And sometimes smiled. The court did not try her. That would have required a public spectacle, and the Bathory name was too old, too entangled with politics. So they found a compromise. Her accomplices were executed. Burned or beheaded. And Erzsébet? She was bricked into her own castle tower. Literally. One small window. No door. No visitors. She was sealed behind stone and silence in August of 1611. The villagers say you could still hear her humming, sometimes. Singing soft lullabies to no one. She lasted 3 years. Died in her sleep, they claimed. Or starved. Or went mad and tore out her own tongue. The truth, as ever, is buried beneath stone and dust. They dismantled parts of the castle. Left other parts to rot. Cactus became a skeleton of itself, ribs exposed to the mountain winds. No one wanted to live there. Not even the desperate. And yet, sometimes a girl goes missing near the woods. Sometimes screams are heard, thin as thread, carried on the frostbitten wind. And sometimes, they say, if you walk near the castle at dusk and speak her name, softly, like a secret, something answers back. Not loudly. Just a hum. Faint. And sweet. History has an odd habit of forgetting the bones it once sharpened its teeth on. In the decades following Countess Erzsébet Bathory's death, the world moved on, as it always does. Kings were crowned and uncrowned. Empires rose like swollen rivers and cracked like spring ice. But in the deep woods of Slovakia, near the ruins of Cactus, the earth remembered. And so did the people. They did not forget what she did. How could they? It was etched into the very stones. But time, being what it is, began to twist the tale. The peasants told it to their children at night not as history, but as warning. A woman too vain, they said, who made a pact with the devil to drink youth from the veins of the innocent. A lady with no shadow. A queen of blood. And yet, beneath those folk tales and flourishes, something colder remained. The records. The testimonies. The names. More than 600 names, if her ledger is to be believed. 600 girls. And not all of them peasants. In 1729, more than a century after her death, a local priest stumbled across a half-buried box in a crypt beneath the ruins. Inside were papers, parchments so brittle they flaked when touched. One bore the seal of the Bathory crest. Another listed purchases of alchemical supplies, mercury, belladonna, crushed rubies, lamb's blood. Some recipes were half Latin, half madness. One mentioned masking the flesh of the unripe. Another bore only a single line, written over and over in a curling hand. Time cannot see what time cannot touch. These were not merely the ramblings of a lonely widow. This was a system, an obsession. By the 18th century, Erzsébet's legend had caught the attention of scholars, mystics, and eventually the press. She became a curiosity, a Gothic warning for young women and an erotic villain for the salacious imagination of old Europe. French salons whispered her name beside that of Gilles de Rais and Vlad Dracula. Not as people, but as types. The devourers. The cursed nobility. But strip away the lace and rot, and what remains is a woman who was given everything: wealth, power, education, and chose to consume others as though they were kindling for her vanity. And yet, she was not alone. The truth is, Erzsébet Bathory did not act in a vacuum. She was a product of her class, her time, her culture. The noble courts of Hungary in the 16th century were not gentle places. Torture was law. Servants were property. Wives were expected to endure, and often administer, cruelty in the name of discipline. When Erzsébet whipped a servant until her fingernails came off, no one gasped. When she burned the soles of their feet with red-hot iron, they called it corrective. What horrified them, eventually, was not the pain. It was the scale. The refinement. She had turned punishment into an art form. An aesthetic. And perhaps, that is what chilled them most. One surviving document describes her rituals in extraordinary detail. Written by an unnamed monk who fled the castle in 1609, it reads: "She waits until the second hour of night. The girls are dressed in white linen. They are made to sing. One is chosen. A vein is opened. The Countess anoints her cheeks with it, and whispers a name I do not understand. There is no frenzy. No lust. Only purpose." Elsewhere in the same account he writes, "I do not believe she thinks herself evil. I believe she thinks herself hungry." Hunger. That word returns again and again in the writings of her contemporaries. Hunger for youth. For permanence. For purity. But also for something deeper, something harder to define. Control, perhaps. Of time. Of death. Of her own decay. You see, Erzsébet did not fear dying. She feared rotting, the slow erosion of beauty, the betrayal of flesh. In portraits painted during her youth, she is radiant, pale skin, high cheekbones, dark almond eyes framed by a widow's peak like an arrowhead. By the time of her husband's death, however, a different woman begins to emerge. Hollowed. Wary. Ever adorned, but never soft. One surviving miniature, painted just a year before her arrest, shows her with an uncanny stillness. As if the artist captured her not in pose, but in pause. A moment between breaths. Between masks? She is smiling. But the smile does not reach her eyes. There were rumors, of course, that she survived. That the woman bricked into the tower was a double. That Erzsébet escaped through tunnels beneath Cactus and fled to Vienna. That she lived under a false name, kept her rituals alive, and continued her experiments with blood in secret. These were, perhaps, stories invented by villagers with too much imagination, or too much wine. But curiously, several young women did disappear in Vienna between 1612 and 1615. Unrelated, they said? Coincidence. But superstition is sticky. And the Countess was nothing if not persistent. In 1741, a woman was hanged in Prague for murder. She had posed as a governess, lured girls into the cellar, and bled them slowly. When questioned by the judge, she claimed to be the daughter of the Blood Countess. The court dismissed her as mad. But her journal, preserved in a museum today, begins with an unusual dedication. For mother, whose youth endures in me. Madness? Maybe. Invention? Possibly. But what if Erzsébet's ideas, her rituals, her faith in blood, didn't die with her? What if she planted something deeper than fear? A seed. In the modern era, psychologists have tried to understand Erzsébet Bathory as a phenomenon. Some claim she was a sadist, a narcissist, a sociopath. Others blame epilepsy, psychosis, trauma. But none of those terms fully explain what she did. The planning, the precision, the patience. And there's the inconvenient fact that she was never formally tried. Never convicted. Only confined. Some historians argue she was framed, that political enemies, envious of her wealth and independence, exaggerated the crimes. That she was a powerful woman, alone, in a world that hated such creatures. It's a tempting theory. One that paints her not as a monster, but a victim. And yet, 600 names. 600. Even if only half are true, even if a quarter, the weight of that truth is still unbearable. You do not fall into 600 bodies. You build them, one by one, deliberately, lovingly. And so Cactus remains, crumbling atop its hill, shrouded in fog and legend. The vines have overtaken the tower. The stones are cold as sin. Tourists come now, cameras in hand, eyes wide with morbid awe. They smile for photos in front of the ruins. They touch the cracked walls and say things like, "Can you imagine?" But no one stays after dark. Because beneath the history, beneath the myth, something lingers. Not a ghost. Not exactly. A hunger. The kind that doesn't scream. The kind that waits. That watches. That hums lullabies to the memory of skin. And once, long ago, she was a girl like any other. Once she laughed. Once she loved. Once she believed she could cheat time. And perhaps, in her own way, she did. Because we are still talking about her. Still whispering her name. Erzsébet Bathory. The woman who wore faces. By now, you might expect a neat end. A tied ribbon. A courtroom. A name carved in infamy. But Erzsébet Bathory was never given the privilege, or the punishment, of clarity. She was both erased and eternal, both punished and protected. The nobles silenced her name for a generation. Too many of them shared her blood. Too many had once dined in her halls, toasted with her goblets, sent their daughters to learn courtly manners beneath her cool, terrifying gaze. To bring her truly to justice would be to place the mirror too close to the collective face of a decaying aristocracy. So instead, they buried her behind stone. Pretended it was enough. They buried her, too, in documentation, buried her in half-trials and unchallenged confessions. In testimonies given under torture. In scribbled ledgers half-burnt in a hearth. They buried her behind the line. Let history forget. But it didn't. It never does, not really. Erzsébet was far more than a storybook ghoul. She was a confluence of forces, personal obsession, cultural rot, unchecked privilege, generational trauma, misogyny, superstition. She was the cracked mirror in a society that could not look away. And her legend? It grew long fingers. In the 19th century, Erzsébet's name found a second life in the ink of Gothic revivalists. Writers obsessed with decay and desire found in her a perfect metaphor, an aristocrat, aging, desperate to hold on to her youth, her relevance, her power. A vampire without fangs. A woman who fed not on blood itself, but on the illusion it could buy. It was during this time that her myth blurred with another. Vlad III of Wallachia, Vlad Tepes, the Impaler, had long inspired the tale of Dracula. But Erzsébet brought femininity into the mythos. She became Draculina. A woman both eroticized and demonized. Beautiful, terrifying, painted with long black hair, pale skin, and a chalice raised to her red lips. But the truth, as it often is, was uglier than fiction. She did not charm her victims. She paid them. Or lured them with bread. Or simply ordered them bound. There were no haunted seductions, no midnight lovers turned prey. There was only dominance. Sadism. A surgical coldness that disguised itself, occasionally, as curiosity. One preserved document, stored in the Hungarian National Archives, details a series of letters between Erzsébet and a distant cousin in Transylvania. He was a minor noble and an amateur botanist. Their correspondence begins warmly, with pleasantries and wine recommendations. But gradually it turns strange. In one letter, Erzsébet inquires about a particular flower, the Scopolia carniolica, a plant known for its potent hallucinogenic and sedative properties. It has a curious effect on the blood, she writes. I notice when taken in extract with wormwood and the crushed bone of a newborn lamb, it produces visions. One saw herself split into pieces and yet felt no pain. Another believed she had turned to glass. In another letter, she describes a dream. There was a mirror, not made of silver, but of something red. It did not show my face, only hers. And when I touched the glass, it was warm. It is unclear if this was a poetic metaphor or a veiled confession. The line, as always, was thin. What we do know is this: Bathory's rituals were never merely mechanical. They were symbolic, precise. The girls had to be of a certain age, virginal, unsullied. She had criteria. And the rituals followed stages: cutting, draining, collecting, anointing. Her accomplices kept records. Some crude, some alarmingly exact. In 1610, one of her servants confessed to preparing a mixture she called the bloom. It was said to be made of poppy milk, dried blood, and lavender oil. The mixture was applied to Erzsébet's face every morning for nearly a year. Whether it worked is irrelevant. She believed it did. The psychology is impossible to ignore. Aging, in her mind, was failure. Wrinkled skin was decay. And decay was death. So she fought it with the only tools her world had given her: control, cruelty, and blood. But of course, there were other casualties in her story. Ones who go unnamed, unnoticed. The women who served her but did not participate. The ones who scrubbed the floors after each ritual. Who washed the blood from sheets and mouths. Who kept the fire stoked in the winter chambers. Who looked away, because to look too long was to risk vanishing themselves. What of them? Did they whisper to each other in the halls? Did they carve warnings into the wood under their beds? Did they pray? Did they try to stop her, even once? One record, lost in a provincial archive in Trenton, tells of a scullery maid who ran barefoot through snow in 1608, screaming that the Countess had eaten the light from a girl's face. She was found the next morning, frozen to death at the base of the hill. Her arms had been broken. They said wolves did it. But the villagers never heard wolves that night. And then, there's the matter of the tower. After her breaking in, the tower was sealed completely, stone on all sides save for the slit of a window through which food was passed once a day. It said that on certain mornings, the food would be returned, untouched. But the cup of water would be half empty. That window remains today. No bird nests on its ledge. No ivy climbs its wall. Not even moss. Some say the stone feels warm to the touch in winter. Some say, if you press your ear against the wall, you can still hear breathing. Not words. Just breath. Slow. Measured. Waiting. Of course, modern historians have tried to scrub Erzsébet Bathory clean. Not of her crimes, but of her exaggerations. They argue that 600 is impossible. That many of the records are suspect. That the ledgers may have been planted, or forged. That servants' confessions under torture are unreliable. That political enemies framed her, jealous of her lands and wealth. There is truth to that. She was a woman of immense power in a time when powerful women were feared, hated, and labeled as witches or mad. She owned land, commanded soldiers, had a personal income larger than some barons. She wrote contracts, negotiated treaties, governed estates in her husband's absence. She was not merely decorative. She was formidable. And such women, especially when widowed and unprotected by male authority, became easy scapegoats. But even this defense begins to falter under the weight of her own writings. Of the sheer number of witnesses. Of the rooms. The rooms, after all, were real. And so were the girls. Not all 600 perhaps. But enough. Enough for the walls to remember. Enough for the earth to be stained. Enough for us, centuries later, to still recoil. What remains, in the end, is not clarity. It's contradiction. A woman both brilliant and broken. A villain and a victim. A creature of her time and something entirely beyond it. Not a monster in the way children imagine, but in the way systems make them. She was not born with fangs. She forged them. And she fed, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. Because power, once tasted, has no equal. And perhaps, just perhaps, Because in a world that viewed women as vessels, she decided to become the blade instead. The ruins of Cactus Castle still stand. They rise out of the grasslands like broken teeth, gnawed by wind and rain, visited by tourists in nylon parkas and cheap walking shoes, most of whom know only the headline, "The Countess Who Bathed in Blood." They snap selfies beside the crumbling tower. They giggle nervously at the guide's stories. Some leave coins on the stones, as if appeasing something old. But there is no laughter in the mortar. Only memory. Only echoes. And something colder. Erzsébet Bathory has become something far greater, and far smaller, than she once was. She's a caricature in horror lore. A symbol in feminist literature. A footnote in political discussions on aristocratic impunity. She is villain, victim, metaphor, monster, meme. But she was also real. A woman who spoke, walked, reasoned, justified, punished, and smiled. Who read Latin love poems and crushed the vertebrae of girls not old enough to have ever been kissed. A woman who, for over 2 decades, disappeared peasants from the map of Hungary, and was only stopped when she grew too bold and took from the wrong family. This is what history does with people like Erzsébet Bathory. It twists them, makes them campfire stories, bakes the nuance out of them, turns the ugly, slow burn of systemic cruelty into a single shocking act. She bathed in blood, so much easier than explaining the 1,000 little permissions that led to each girl's death. Because the real horror is not the torture chamber. It's the bureaucracy that let her build it. Let us go back one last time, then, not to the myth, but to the woman. Picture her, sitting in her tower window as a girl, 11 years old, knees drawn to her chest, a book in her lap, a wind rising off the Carpathians, the muffled sound of someone being beaten in the courtyard below. She hears it. She pauses in her reading, and she does not flinch. Because no one around her does. Because punishment is order. Because suffering is the sound of civilization working. And that is how the seed is planted. She would grow, over years, into a woman who believed that life could be measured. That purity had value. That pain was a tool. And she would do what people with unchecked power always do. She would use it. She would convince herself it was noble. That the blood of peasants was not blood at all, but currency, payment for her birthright. And when that power finally collapsed, as it always does, she didn't run. Didn't scream. Didn't even beg. She sat, smoothed her dress, offered tea, and looked her cousin in the eye. It's easy, now, to treat Erzsébet Bathory like a ghost. A thing of the past. The kind of creature that could never exist in our age of lights and laws. But look closer. At the reports that go unread. At the girls who still vanish. At the systems that protect those with the right name, the right wealth, the right excuses. At the hunger for youth, for beauty, for power that drives entire industries, quietly, in the background. Bathory is not unique. She is a prism. And if you stare too long, you might see something familiar refracted back at you. Not her cruelty. Not her rituals. But her certainty. That nothing would stop her. That no one dared. And so we fade now. Away from the tower. Where the stones are cold and quiet. Where the wind passes through broken arrow slits like breath. Where snow falls in spring, sometimes as if mourning. The moon lifts over Cactus. Pale, full, gentle. The kind of moon that softens the earth, that makes monsters seem like myths and ruins like fairy tales. In the valleys below, the villages sleep. Doors are locked. Fires crackle in stoves. Mothers tuck children in and whisper prayers not to saints, but to safety. Up in the hills, a fox pads through the grass, nose low, tail twitching. It passes under the shadow of the old tower without pause. It does not look up. Even the beasts here know that some things are best left undisturbed. Inside, nothing stirs. No breath. No voice. Only a single stone chamber, half collapsed, filled with dust and the faintest smell of iron. But if you linger long enough, if the night is just right and the wind sighs in a certain key, you might feel it, faint and slow, Not horror. Not evil. But a memory of arrogance. Of a woman who thought she could outpace time. Outbuy decay. Outbleed God. And though she is long gone, something remains. A lesson. A shadow. A name scratched into the walls of history like a scream muffled behind stone. Erzsébet.